All right, welcome to week three. This week we are revisiting issues related to the Constitution. This chapter really shows you the consequences of limited government. What you're going to find as you read this material is that there are a lot of Supreme Court decisions that you need to take the time to know the names and understand what was going on. In no small way, this is about brute memorization. This is the sort of subject where, that are just made for 3x5 index cards. You just write the constitutional amendments or Supreme Court decisions on one side, and then on the other side describe the amendment or decision and why it's important. And then you just go through them a dozen or so times. I hate to say it, but that is often the most effective way to learn the material. One of the most important parts of this chapter is the incorporation doctrine, which refers to the Supreme Court's interpretation of the 14th Amendment's Due Process Clause that extends the Bill of Rights to the states. Previously, the Bill of Rights only constrained the actions of the federal government. So now the federal courts can hold state police, liable if they're behaving in a discriminatory manner. And incorporation also means that Congress is empowered to remedy instances where states are discriminating against minorities or other vulnerable groups. Incorporations makes civil rights claims feasible now in federal courts. As for our Bill of Rights guarantees, what are we to make, for example, of the Second Amendment? The current view of the Supreme Court is that the Second Amendment guarantees individuals the right to possess firearms. That was basically asserted in the 2008 decision in Heller. That has not always been the Supreme Court's decision. If you look at the wording of the Second Amendment, it reads, "A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed." Does that complex sentence mean that all individuals have an absolute right to any kind of gun? Currently, it's easier for some states for a person to buy an AR-15 than it is to operate a car. Is that a sustainable state of affairs? I'm open to questions. My view is that the intent of the writers of the Second Amendment was for the states to have the capacity to form and maintain militias, and that they primarily were worried about the threat of a central government with a standing army infringing on the right of states to arm and train militias. I do not personally believe that an individual right to own a gun should be unlimited, and that there are a number of sensible regulations that could help reduce the number of mass killings. But that's just me. I'm open to discussing the matter. Another important issue related to civil liberties is the idea of privacy. Do we have a right to be left alone? How far can we push that right? Do we have a right to consume drugs that others might view as dangerous? Do we have the right to engage in sexual relations with others that might be viewed as, by others as profoundly immoral? Do we have a right, if we are in the terminal stages of a disease, to end our lives? As a country, our views regarding the right to privacy have really become fluid, and it's hard for me to say where the line on a lot of these issues is drawn. I welcome any questions that you might have about privacy. While civil liberties are claims to rights that governments, now both the federal and state government, cannot abridge without due process, civil rights claims are based on the idea that members of stigmatized groups have already been subject to adverse discrimination, and that the government has a positive duty to remedy that harm. The argument for civil rights naturally gives rise to affirmative action programs in which members of discriminated groups are provided with the kind of preferential treatment as it relates to the distribution of public goods. Now, obviously, this is a controversial issue. So a lot of Americans reject the idea that discrimination persists and ask, why should I be penalized for the discrimination of past generations? Large percentage of Americans believe in the notion of merit, that people should be rewarded based on the work they do, not on some victim status. I would acknowledge that there are important issues at stake here. But I would also say that the evidence of persistent discrimination seems to me to be too obvious to ignore. To use the metaphor of a track race, how can you expect people to view the outcome of a race as just if some competitors are forced to start the race from a quarter mile behind the competitors. That's the kind of metaphor that Lyndon Johnson used to justify the Civil Rights Act, and I believe it effectively illustrates the challenges that we confront today, particularly with the massive amount of income inequality that we have tolerated over the past few decades. All right, so I've tried to give you some insight into this chapter. Obviously, there's a lot of ground to cover, and so I hope we're going to learn a lot this week. Let's get to work.